general, it's very important to check everything that you believe.
Some of the newer practitioners,
so much misinformation out there.
It's healthy to question your ideologies.
take people's unverified personal gnosis.
All these different bad habits like
Reasonings with ourselves and going over rationality.
thinking everyone's against you, thinking everyone else is wrong.
Escapism,
Attacking others because they don't agree with you.
where they don't want to deal with like any negativity or any criticism,
The right hand and the left hand path.
And it feels like a personal attack against you.
any sort of darkness or badness in their
Where
life.
the dichotomy begins.
It's important to open yourself.
Is it really valuable or meaningful?
My name is AIDEN.
GEORGINA.
Chandler.
Welcome to Occultism, the side of Saul.
In this episode, we're going to talk about what age you should be in when you enter the occult. The occult is something that people tend to, enter when they're older, but as social media has grown and as the acceptance of pagan spirituality has grown, more and more people are incorporating children into the occult, and I feel like every couple months a new book comes out that's like Wicca for kids, or you see more Facebook groups talking about like Thelema for kids and all these different philosophies and religions and occult practices. And so we kind of wanted to attack it on all angles because I think when people say what age you get into the occult, it's kind of hard to answer that as like a single question. I think it really depends on what you're talking about when you mean the occult and what exactly the level of involvement is. And of course, like the maturity level that different children have. So in this episode, we're going to be attacking that, all about age, the occult, milestones, and whether or not kids should be involved in magic.
That one of the biggest things is the occult's such a broad topic. There's so many different unique aspects of it, and you can't just say one thing is the occult. There's a lot of different practices within it. So when you want to introduce your children to the occult, you have to ask, what are you introducing them to? Are you introducing them to something like candle magic, folk magic, or are you introducing them to something more dangerous? It really depends on what you're talking about here.
I definitely think that there is a lot of reservation around the idea of kids working with anything that is mystic or outside of the church in a really like kind of societal context, at least here in the West. A big thing for me is growing up, I always heard a lot of like, oh, you'll find out when you're older, or oh, this isn't like age appropriate for you. And that's something that I think we need to apply to certain occult spaces and try to recognize where children might not be the best fit to be in those spaces. Now, of course, there is a certain distinction that I think we should make at the beginning, and that I would like to talk about as a separate discussion before we even really dive into this, and that's kind of because when we talk about Wicca and kids in the occult and lighter practices, it can kind of bring up the religious raising of kids. And I want to kind of ask you guys what your take is on introducing a religion that might have some things that aren't necessarily age appropriate for children. Do you think it's okay to really start at that age? Like, do you think it's the same as getting initiated into Christianity whenever you're first born, as you're baptized as a baby?
Okay, so my thoughts are, when it comes to baptism as a baby, I've actually always kind of had some issues with it. Personally, I think that religion is a very personal thing, and you shouldn't really commit someone to a religion before they can articulate what the religion means. Though I do get why parents do it when they're Christian. They're scared that if they don't do it, their kid will go to hell. And I think if you fully believe that, it makes sense why you would baptize, even though you have zero consent to do so. So I get why parents do it, even though I disagree with it. But the thing with certain occult practices and religions, I'm going to speak a little bit about Wicca and Thelema because I practice Thelema, so it's something that I have personal experience with and can talk on. Um, Thelema with kids, I actually have kind of an issue with because the Thelemic philosophy you can teach to kids, and you can teach them like ideas tangentially related to Thelema, but the intrinsic core of Thelema has a lot of sexual content to it, and a lot of Thelemic rituals have strong sexual imagery, even if it's not like nudity, like you know what I mean. Like there's strong sexual tones to a lot of it, and I think that's really inappropriate for children to be around. Personally, um, I think like a teenager's a little different, but I think like you can teach these religions and philosophies that have more sexual tones to them at upper levels in a more abstracted way to younger kids. Because obviously your kids want to understand what you're doing and understand your beliefs. And so my personal take on that is like if it's a paradigm that has a lot of like sexual undertones or sexual things at upper levels, just teach it in an abstracted way, just like you do with love or anything else that has these kind of like heavier implications that you figure out when you're older.
I agree with that a lot. Like, I think that a lot of, especially in Thelema, a lot of sexual imagery in these more pagan traditions, it's not okay to introduce to your kids at all. You should probably keep that away from them until they're old enough to understand it. I think that with religion, it's a very tricky thing because I don't believe that children should be indoctrinated into any religion, that they should be free to choose their own religion. I think that it's natural for us to teach our religion to our children because that's what we know best and it's a big part of our life. But I think that you should definitely teach that religion if you want to, and also incorporate other religions and try to educate yourself on those if you can, and not shut down other religions as not being an option for them. I'd also say that, like, there's adult themes in all types of religions. In Christianity, there's literally a dying God, like graphic imagery of being crucified right in front of your children, which is something I've actually talked about a few times with people. It's a really interesting thing that we're okay with showing children like a dead person hanging on a cross because it's just so natural to us in our Western culture because that's the religion that many of us grew up with. But overall, there are a lot of more adult themes in various religions that should be kept from children, that we shouldn't directly showing them these things when they're really young. Obviously, like, don't lie about it. Don't lie about like your children ask about it. But you shouldn't be directly exposing them to these like more mature themes until they're ready for them.
I definitely am of the stance that you know, protect the kids. I'm more so like I'm not someone who's going to kind of like judge someone based on if they want to raise their kids religiously, but I do think that if you do that, you should be like more so trying to teach them life lessons and ways to live their life to the fullest, or whatever you find as the part of fulfillment in your life you get from your religion. Try to teach that to your kids and try to get your kid to be able to fulfill their life in that way. And if they are curious, I would embrace their curiosity. And if they want to, you know, come to more things and they like it, full on welcome their curiosity and teach as much as you can to them. I think that it is very interesting to kind of pick and choose what imagery is and isn't okay. Like we have, like Aiden said, a man who is dead on a cross in the Christian church, and that is okay to like show to children, but if it is something that is commonly seen as scary or demonic, that is controversial, and you are all of a sudden introducing your kids to Satan, and Satan is stealing the children, which is a whole nother tangent. But outside of religious practices, I think that or like religions that might have some themes that can be seen as inappropriate for children, there are also some practices that can be seen as inappropriate for children, such as the idea of using blood in magic or bodily fluids in magic, things that we as more advanced practitioners say, oh, you probably shouldn't practice that if you're a beginner, and things that if you introduce them to kids can quite possibly hurting them either psychologically or physically.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you should definitely keep blood magic away from children. They can know it exists, but I think teaching something like that to a kid is really, and by kid I mean older child. We're not talking about I'm not talking about super babies. Because I assume you wouldn't teach your baby about blood magic. I think we can universally agree that's a bad idea. Is because people in their early teens have a high rate of developing self-harm behaviors. I remember being that age and knowing quite a few of my friends who are dealing with self-harm, and I think magic and blood magic can really enable those behaviors or act as a gateway to them. We know that it's very different when you give a blood offering, but when you're younger, that line is going to be less clear, and I could see that developing into a self-harm habit, and something that's really important is keeping your kids away from that. Furthermore, when someone is in their late childhood, early teens, they're going through a lot of hormonal and emotional changes. I can say for a fact I was really not super stable back then. I had a lot going on, and I think heavy occultism would have made my mental health worse. I did get into the occult during my teenage years, but it was after I was more stable. I think if you're still trying to figure yourself out and you're going through puberty and things in your life are kind of unstable, teaching your child heavy occultism is pretty risky. Since the occult can be something that can help you, but if you're not in a really good place, it can be quite damaging. And I think just mental health, like you go through so much in your late childhood, early teen years, that adding magic to the mix can sometimes be destabilizing. I got into magic as a teenager, but I think there's other things you need to have yourself somewhat together before you can focus on the occult, in my opinion, because the occult is something that can be so destabilizing at times with the way that it plays with the deeper parts of your psychology.
Psychology plays a big part in the occult, and I think that if we're going to introduce it to our kids, we need to understand that they're not as mature as we are, and that they're not going to have the same understandings that we do. Magic to a kid is going to probably be a lot more mythical and fantastical than it is going to be to us. We need to keep that in mind as well, and be careful what we're telling our children.
I think that a huge part of kind of these upper level practices, and the reason why we tell people to wait for them wait to do them till they are older, is because they do hold that kind of risk of developing a behavior or proposing a danger that is sometimes can lead to something that's life-threatening. Even things that are practices such as beneficium, where you work with poisons. It can be this kind of curiosity kills the cat sort of situation, where you introduce something that you really love and you really like to someone who is not ready to handle it, or will get too excited about it and end up facing the repercussions. Psychologically speaking, I think that it is very controversial to kind of suggest to your kid to work with their own consciousness and really develop these ideas that you can manipulate the world around you by working with yourself, and kind of like higher metaphysical concepts that are how you say, like crossing the abyss and doing things that are like the Abraham Mellon procedure, even things that you should be prepared for, learned for, and well studied for, and kind of going into these things that either seem cool or dark or edgy or things that fit what you kind of want for the moment without really learning what it takes to perform it. I think that ultimately I wouldn't, but there are certain things in psychology that kind of do tie into the occult world, because there is an argument out there to say that a lot of occult practice is psychological, which I can honestly see as valid. But to teach your kids these practices is kind of a different story, because it's teaching them to work with their inner mind, and that might be seen as controversial.
Yeah, I want to go back to your major milestone. Sorry, I want to go back to your major milestone rituals that you brought up. Kids, when they're younger and into teen years, tend to assume that they're more knowledgeable than they actually are. As we touched on in our imposter syndrome episode, you have to climb the peak of Mount Stupid to develop imposter syndrome, and during learning, early on, we tend to reach a point where we think we know everything. When you combine the occult commonness for this to happen with teenage behavior, it's very common that people will do rituals that they aren't ready for because they think they're ready. In my personal life, I know a practitioner who began when they were about 14, and at age 15 or 16, it was 15 or 16, something like that, she decided to attempt to cross the abyss, and it went really bad. She had a complete mental breakdown, and I haven't spoken to her since then. So I really don't know what happened to her. I wish her the best. So much love to her if she is somehow listening to this, but I doubt so. But yeah, I mean, whenever I see people jumping into dangerous practice, it just reminds me of this practitioner, and I get really worried and become like the mom friend. But there's a reason why, if we're talking about the Abraham Mellon procedure, that it says you have to be age 25 to do it. I don't think the age 25 should be such a hard lock, but I think these rituals that are associated with certain ages have those associations for a reason, because when you're younger, you're probably not ready for them, and you're probably not in a place where you can do them. I have not done the Abraham Mellon ritual, okay? I want to do it before I die, but I just know that personally I'm not ready. Also, I don't have the financial state to be able to just go off the grid for a year and a half. It's not where I'm at right now. I'd love that, but I just know I'm not there yet. And that's fine. And I think when you're younger, you're more likely to kind of assume, oh, I'm ready for things. Oh, I'm prepared. And not take a moment and go, wait, am I ready for this? Especially with practices like Goetia. I see a lot of teenagers getting into the Goetia, and I actually experimented with the Goetia bit when I was a teenager. But I didn't really know exactly what I was doing, and I kind of cringe at somewhat, which cringing at your past self is a sign of growth, but my methods were really not that great. I feel lucky that I didn't screw myself over, to be honest. I got pretty lucky with that, but it's you need to take care of yourself, and just know that teenagers are gonna think that they're more ready than they actually are. And so if you're a mystical parent raising a child, I would kind of talk to them regularly, hey, Rome wasn't built in a day. You can be able to do these practices later on. or if you're even a solitary teenage practitioner, I'm sure our demographics are like almost all adults, but maybe there's a teenager listening to this somewhere. I don't know. Just know like that you may not be ready for things. That doesn't mean you'll never be able to do it. It just means you're not there yet. I think all three of us can say there's certain things we're not ready for, and that's okay. And I just think this risk of jumping into things before we're ready is a big thing that's going to come up when we're talking about young practitioners and people getting into the occult at a very young age.
Definitely. There was a proverb that I shared a couple episodes ago. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and that holds true in here too. I think that it's okay to like learn about things because they are something you're passionate about, but you should be wary of whether or not you should perform them. Like, you can learn about something all you want. That doesn't necessarily mean you should do it, and you can apply that to several mundane and magical examples. And then there's also the mentality of expanding your knowledge. You brought up the Goetia, and I kind of wanted to talk about this idea from the perspective of the outsider looking in, because this has grown more and more recently in the news, and that's kind of the idea of like the devil or Satan stealing your kids. And you brought up the Goetia, and I don't know if you've seen this, but I've seen these little pages from a kid's picture book called Goetia for Kids. And I don't know how I feel about the Ars Goetia being for kids. I don't know a lot about demonology, or really any Solomonic magic at all. But I feel like that's not the best idea.
No reason that your children should be practicing Goetia at like a young age. It's a much more mature practice. It takes years of study before even attempting it. If you don't have a grasp of what you're doing, then you can be messed up really easily. And like, that goes for a lot of practices. There's a lot of higher magical practices. I'm not talking like high magic specifically, but like there's a lot of higher magical practices that can be extremely dangerous if you're going to be attempting them without more knowledge or a better understanding of the world around you. A lot of children don't really have that understanding of the world around them before they jump into something.
Yeah, I think like it's a very different conversation if we're talking about like, you know, it's just a very different conversation if we're talking about things like sigil magic or herbalism, and then things like Goetia. You know what I mean? Like, it's a whole different can of worms, and you know, I think that the average person knows that there's a huge difference between the two, but I think when people are unsupervised young practitioners, like I was not under any sort of lineage, I didn't know any other practitioners, people can kind of jump into things too quickly. But I mean, overall, it's just a rough can of worms, and I think it depends on the child or teenager as well. Certain people are more ready for things, certain people have more maturity of them innately, and so it can just become a tricky conversation.
One thing I'd like to talk about is how do both of you feel about introducing your children to the concept of a deity? What I see this brought up a lot is that like working with the deity is a very advanced practice and you shouldn't be getting into it, but we have Christianity where they're introduced to a deity almost from day one.
So I was going to hit on that point as well. The idea of like so in a lot of occult spaces we also have initiatory rites, which we can see in the baptism, right? But a lot of people, whenever they leave Christianity, have the sudden like you know, or not even Christianity, but an Abrahamic monotheistic religion, typically it is Christianity, and you leave it to be pagan or explore another religion or philosophy. But typically the conversion that I see in my spaces are pagans who have converted from either Christianity or a Judeo-Christian background, and they kind of have regained, or they kind of have this fear of all gods, and it's commonly said like, oh, don't work with a deity, or don't do this, like just praise and worship if you are a beginner, which I find really puzzling, because I think that if you are like praising, worshiping, if you know about the deity, if you're learning about the deity, if you're studying about the deity, if the deity has a myth, or if there is a book attributed to it, such as Odin with the Wanderer's Havamal, if there is some texts like anything that can be a source material for you, or a kind of way to learn about how to do what you want to do with a deity, I don't think that it really makes sense to go out and say, oh, deity work is super advanced, when things such as prayer get practiced daily. Things like meditation is like practiced essentially daily for a lot of people. There is also this idea of like, when you work with a deity, you're going to like work with them wrong or something like that, because there are a lot of misinterpretations in the community that I am a bigger part of, communities that are for witchcraft practitioners and folk magicians, practitioners of folk magic, stuff like that. There's a lot of like misinformation out there, a lot of stuff that's like, oh, the Saturnine chthonic deity is your mommy, and she's gonna take care of you because in her myth she protects a child, so she's the protector of mothers and children, and she's adopting you as her child when you work with them. And that's like more on the part of you should have a conversation about, you need to research and know what deity you're working with, instead of saying, oh, that's advanced, don't do it. I think you should advocate more research and ways to start working with something, rather than say, no, don't do that, because it's not like deity worship is not a complex topic or concept. So I personally disagree with the idea that deity work is advanced.
Yeah, this is always something that's really interesting to me, because I think it's interesting, because I've definitely been someone who's told people that deity work is more advanced. But I think I think this has been a phenomenon, because when you're a pagan, a lot of people come in through witchcraft, and witchcraft is very results focused. And so when people talk about deity work in a witchcraft context, or in a cult, or like a magical context, they're almost always talking about like involving evocations and invocations. And so when people talk about deities they work with, they're almost always they seem to conflate it with summoning and invocation and evocation a lot. And they forget that there are other ways to work with deities. Like in witchcraft communities, you don't see much of an emphasis on prayer or There is a bit on offerings, but prayer, as kind of the most common way anyone anywhere works with a deity and is very beginner friendly, is forgotten. And so people see deities as something you work with for manifestation, for results, and something in a spirit conjure context, and ignore just the religious context, because I think a lot of people kind of identify as a witch first and a pagan second, or a witch first and a religious person second. And so they assume everyone else has the same approach and mentality, when in actuality it can be really different. And so I think that's where the core of that comes from. They aren't assuming that people are just worshiping to worship, you know what I mean? They're like, oh, you're gonna work with a spirit. Because we went over working and worshiping is very different. In terms of the Hecate is my mommy thing, I always find that interesting because I think that's a leftover from Abrahamic ideas that God is the father, and just kind of lumping all female deities into a mother archetype, rather than giving it, like, the nuance that female deities can have. So that's my hot take.
I think that, like, introducing that concept to your children is fine. Looping back around to the children's topic. I kind of see this a lot as well, like with what Chandler and Georgia were saying with Hekate's mommy, because they take the idea that there has to be a parental figure because of Yote Zalfe being a father figure. I think that's a really interesting concept to think about. Not every female deity has to be a mother figure, and there's also different types of mothers. And you can see that throughout different cultures as well.
Involving kind of tradition, or even in a context of kind of the idea of working with something, or committing to something. I know that there's a lot of initiatory rites, such as like becoming one with the Green Man, or having kind of how you say, like, dark baptism, or signing your name in the book of the beasts, whatever you want to call it, for a lot of different traditions that might be from a family lineage, or or like something that you are just introduced to. Do you guys find any of those to be inappropriate for kids, or do you feel like most initiations have a kid-friendly version? Or do you think that kids should not be initiated into a group at all, because that is somewhat of a commitment?
Is a nuanced topic, because initiations can look a lot of different ways. I think I've noticed in the pagan community it's very common for covens and orders to have an 18-year-old age limit, and to be pretty strict about this, because they don't want people joining who their parents don't approve, because it is illegal to teach a religion to kids that their parents don't approve of, or something like that. I don't know the logistics of the law, but there's something like that. And so I think with covens and orders, I think it makes sense to delay initiation to 18, because you don't want kids coming from families that don't approve, because that can get really messy, and a lot of more pagan rites are just not kid-friendly. And I think if you're going to do a big initiation rite, right, like, I think it's better to wait than water it down. Because what's a watered-down initiatory rite going to do for you? Nothing, you know? Like, you want the ritual to be as pure as possible and as strong as possible, because initiations are a big deal, you know? Like, initiations are something that really can't be undone, and they're very massive. And so I think watering down a ritual to do it earlier kind of detracts from the purity of the ritual, and you don't want to you don't want to sacrifice quality for getting it done quickly. I think with magic, like, quality matters more than quantity, and doing things in a way that is best for you is what really matters.
One thing that happens a lot with religions is when you put them on your children is that they have a lasting effect into the adult's life. Even if you're not very heavily indoctrinating them, you'll have some people will just continue to go to mass after you've moved out because that's what they're used to. There's people who will even retain some of their Christian ideologies even though they're atheists, things like that. Religion can have a really long-lasting effect on a person's life from a young age. It's really one of the first influences that they get if it's from a family source.
Yeah, I think that religion and spirituality is something that makes a big imprint on kids. I'm an adult and I've not believed my birth religion to its fullest for a long time, but I still have hangups. What you say to your kids in the first few years of their life makes a huge impact on them. And so I think being really mindful of this and being really cautious is really important, and like taking care of your kids and making sure that they're in a good mental state is really important. And so I think just be mindful. Indoctrination is something we want to avoid at all costs, because we talk all the time about how the occult is so open, it's all so personal, but anything you're teaching to a young kid is going to be kind of pushed upon them rather than something that they're naturally gravitating towards. And so I think being really careful is really paramount. And it just makes a big difference to know like how kids work, and just check in on your child, see how they react to spirituality, see if it's something they're drawn to or it's something that they would rather play blocks. And magic is always here. Like, it's never gonna go away, right? Like, waiting isn't gonna change it. It's not gonna make you unable to ever make your kid an occultist. Like, you can have them wait. They'll still be around, there will still be magic, and they can still find their path.
And this idea that you need to push or kind of have your ideas instilled to kind of have this successful correlation, or kind of have this idea that if your family isn't a complete unit that works in the same mindset, that you're going to be met with this destruction that's going to tear it apart. And I don't think that's necessarily true when it comes to religion and spirituality. I think as long as you're willing to have civil and open discussions about things and take more of a point of view of really trying to accept and understand people as people first and foremost, and not as part of a certain group. Like, don't try to understand someone who is practicing Christianity as a Christian, because that's limiting them to just one very specific scenario or type. Try to kind of analyze what your kid really wants and what their desires are, and if they do have a draw towards anything that's occult or metaphysical or witchcraft or religious or spiritual, then embrace that curiosity and try to get them familiar with what you think would be good for them to get familiar with it at their age.
I think that involving the occult with your children can be a really good bonding experience. It can also be very dangerous if you don't know what you're doing, if you're teaching them something that they're not prepared for. I think that it's a very tough balance to strike that you need to work on and to research a lot before you actually introduce them to it. It shouldn't be something that you should be introduced to the little kids who are like 5-year-olds or something like that. It should be something that should be gradually introduced and incorporated into their lives. overall, just understanding that not everything is meant to be taken on when you are 18 is something good. And you should pace yourself. You should make sure that you're understanding the basics, that you're going through everything in a methodic manner, that you're really understanding what you're doing.
My final thoughts are that religion, spirituality, and children is a really tricky area, and even into the teen years, it can be kind of tricky. While most occultists get their start around this age, I think it's really important to be mindful of how you're teaching it and what you're teaching it so that your kid is doing it out of their own free will and not out of indoctrination. It's all about balance, and depending on your situation, it's going to look really different. And so it's really important to be mindful, check in with your child's emotions, and make sure that it's something that they organically want. This stuff's just hard. It's a tricky gray area, and it's easy to, like, parenting is just hard, you know? Like, it takes a long time to really learn how to parent properly, and so it's tricky, and what matters most is to prioritize your child and make sure that it's something they want and teach them slowly and remind them that, hey, no matter how much you want to do magic, it'll always still be there. And if you're an older teen who's trying to cross the abyss, just know, like, hey, there's gonna be times after when I'm 15 to do these rituals. They won't go away. If anything, they'll be better because I'll have more like access to materials and more things on hand. And so it's just pace yourself and know that no matter what, there'll be time. Magic isn't going away anytime soon.
I think you should be open to the idea of teaching your kids different things, but I think you should recognize certain subjects, certain topics aren't very appropriate to teach to kids. If you have a very strong urge to keep a tradition running in your family, I'm sure that there are recorded texts. I'm sure that there are things that you can do with your child to kind of share small things that you can adapt into your kid's life without completely investing something that might be a little bit inappropriate or a little bit advanced or something you just don't even feel comfortable sharing with your kid. Ultimately, parenting is a combination of choices. So if your child takes an interest in something and you want to embrace it, or if you want to put your kid or bring your kid with you to whatever practice you are a part of, or whatever church or coven or whatever you please with you, and are happy with that, then of course that's your choice. But I do think that there should be a conversation in all spaces about where kids can be seen as appropriate versus inappropriate, and what information, what topics we should be really sharing with the children, and how far we should go to protect them, or if there are certain things that we should allow them to learn and treat as scrapes and bruises of life.
So, this has been Georgina.
I've been AIDEN.
And I'm Chandler.
And you've been listening to Occultism with a Side of Salt. Cut.